And to all of you who have joined this presentation on the Wilderness Act Fundamentals, Wilderness Act 101, thank you. Thank you for giving your time today. And thank you for what you do for wilderness. I appreciate it. It's been a very challenge last summer and coming into this year. So for all of you wilderness stewards out there, thank you for what you do. You'll see my email, my email address and my phone number there. So if you want to reach out to me or if you have follow-up questions for me, please connect. So if we're going to talk wilderness and we're going to talk 1964, we need to connect to the Beatles. Well, the Beatles invaded America. The Beatles invaded America in February of 1964 when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. That time period of the early 1960s and 1964 in particular was a very tumultuous time. This is a time of the civil rights movement, of Martin Luther King, of a real concern across America about the environment and what we were doing to the environment. So putting all of this in context, it's amazing that in 1964, the Wilderness Act was passed. Today, we're going to take a look at your job, the role that you play in wilderness, and connect that to the actual law, to the Wilderness Act. Then I will go back and mention about administrative protection that Bill Hodge and others mentioned with the Gila Wilderness. Then we're going to dive in and look very closely at the Wilderness Act, in particular Section 2, Policy and Definition section, and Section 4, which deals with prohibited uses and special provisions. And then finally, folks, I'd like to end on some words about intervention and the challenge for you as future managers to let it be. But we have a poll question here, and Jacob is going to help us with a poll question, which is, what is your major wilderness stewardship role? Is a major part of your job in wilderness as a wilderness ranger dealing with public contacts? Is it trails? Is it working on invasive species? Are you doing campsite impact or campsite inventories, wreck site inventories? Is it wilderness character work? Is it wildlife research, fire, or something else? So if you take a minute and answer the poll here that Jacob's running for you, what is your major wilderness stewardship role? Wilderness character monitoring, 39% say that that is their major role in wilderness stewardship, the work they do, followed by public contacts, wilderness ranger work, and then right behind that, trail work.
And in the chat,
go ahead.
Ralph, there's a few folks that are in planning, force leadership, a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Yeah, well, very good. Thank you for taking that poll. And it does really help me to see the wilderness character monitoring was #1, but there is no doubt a lot of you wear multiple hats. You do multiple things in wilderness. But what I wanted to offer to you, if I can move forward. No matter what your job in wilderness, you can connect your primary job directly back to the Wilderness Act, to the law. For those who said that you mostly were involved in public contacts or wilderness ranger work, that is specifically mentioned under the educational theme of Section 2A. If you mention trail work, that's in Section 4B under the administration of the area as wilderness. If you're involved in down at the bottom in the lower right, in any of the invasive weed studies and monitoring. That's specifically mentioned in section 4D1 of the Wilderness Act. And then of course, wilderness character, the whole idea of preserving wilderness character is strongly mentioned in both sections 2 and section 4 of the Wilderness Act. And we're going to go over that today. So Bill Hodge, in the earlier presentation on the history, actually mentioned this when the Forest Service, thanks to Aldo Leopold, helped write the report and have the Forest Service approve the very first wilderness area, but it was an administrative, a Forest Service administratively established wilderness in 1924. What is so important about this, and a lot of people don't know, is the other agencies were also doing something very similar to this. The National Park Service already had policies and some land classifications in place that were what you might call wilderness light, but they were administrative protections for the Park Service. Same with Fish and Wildlife Service. They too had some protective language in policy and in regulations for their wildlife refuge. So all of these agencies were moving towards some kind of protection for their landscapes. But what's so critically important is all of these, being administrative, could be wiped out with the stroke of the pen and the very next director, the next park director, the next chief of the Forest Service, that these areas could go away. So what is so critical, and this came up in the last presentation, that time period from 1924 to 1964, those 40 years were critical because essentially all the conservation groups were rallying around one major theme, and that was there ought to be a law that instead of this constant being on the defensive and trying to stop some project, some activity that was going to go into these primitive areas, into these protected areas, and they were constantly having to fight threats, that instead of this rear guard, as Bill appropriately mentioned there, that instead of being on the defense, the agencies and wilderness needed to be on the offense. There ought to be a law. And that's exactly where we're headed. Because keep in mind, folks, before the Wilderness Act was passed, recognize this. Before the Wilderness Act was passed, there was no national policy to preserve wilderness for any of the agencies. There was no uniform definition of wilderness. There was no nationwide system of areas protected as wilderness. And there was no uniform management guidance. So before 1964, essentially, there was no commitment to preserve wilderness in perpetuity. That is such an important point to capture, and what leads up to the why. Why did we need wilderness? So here is the famous picture of President Johnson signing the Wilderness Act in the Rose Garden on September 3rd, 1964. There is so many backstories to this famous picture. I wish we had the time where I could go over all of the characters involved here and the stories behind the stories. But I think you might be noticing how many of the congressmen, senators, and dignitaries that are in this picture are in fact white male, white men. But at the time, just so you're aware of it, in 1964, there was actually 14 women in Congress in 1964, 2 on the Senate side and 12 on the House side. In this famous picture, Johnson is handing the presidential pin from the signing of the act first to Alice Zahniser, the lady closest to President Johnson. Alice was the wife of Howard Zahniser, the principal author of the Wilderness Act. He was the executive secretary and later the executive director for the Wilderness Society and the editor of their Living Wilderness publication, their quarterly publication. Howard Zahniser passed away 4 months before the signing of the Wilderness Act. He passed in May of 1964. So Alice, his wife, is accepting the pin from President Johnson on behalf of her husband. Next to Alice, another wilderness champion in her own right, the famous Marty Murray. Marty was there to accept the pin for her husband, Ollis Murray, who was the president of the Wilderness Society, who had passed away in the fall of 1963. So here are the 2 ladies accepting the pins on behalf of their husbands. During my career with the Forest Service, I had the honor to meet and to discuss wilderness with both of these ladies. It's really a great memory for me that I had time to spend with Alice Zahniser and Marty Murray. So here they are accepting the pins, but notice I've given you an arrow to someone else in that famous picture. Off to the left there, you see Congressman Wilbur Mills of Arkansas. And I wanted to highlight him as just one of the backstories of many. But this man, Wilbur Mills, had no business in this picture. He had nothing to do with the Wilderness Act. The reason he was there is because right after President Johnson signed the Wilderness Act into law, there was a second piece of legislation that was being signed. And for the trivia question of the day, that other legislation was the Lands and Water Conservation Fund. And Wilbur Mills was the chairman on the House side for the Ways and Means Committee. He is there to be part of the signing of the Lands and Conservation Act. He had nothing to do with the Wilderness Act. So another person that you did not see in that famous picture is this person. Any of you recognize this gentleman? This was the freshman congressman from Texas, Congressman Joe Poole from Dallas, Texas. Supposedly, as the story goes, when the votes were taken, the Wilderness Act passed on the Senate side, 73 in favor, and there were 12 opposing votes. On the House side, 373 approving votes on the House side, but there was 1 dissenting vote. Now, of course, there was some absentee. There were 12 absentee votes and a few who did not vote. But the one dissenting vote was this gentleman right here. And as the story goes, when he found out he was the one dissenting vote, he turned to a colleague on the House floor and he said, "What am I going to do? When the press finds out that I was the one dissenting vote, they're going to eat me alive. What am I going to do?" And the colleague turned to him, he said, "You have only one choice, and that is to go out there and tell the press that you voted against the Wilderness Act because it did not go far enough. It did not do enough for wilderness." So right before Howard Zahniser, this is him, the principal author of the Wilderness Act, there's a quote from him at his very final testimony just 2 weeks before he passed away. He wrote this, or he said this in April of 1964. He died in early May. Let me read it to you. We are establishing for the first time in the history of the earth a program, a national policy whereby areas of wilderness can be preserved. That will not be the end of our efforts. That is just the beginning. And for you folks who are new to wilderness or new to wilderness stewardship, this is you. It's not the end, this is the beginning. And this is your role as future leaders of wilderness. Looking at the system, in 1964, when the Wilderness Act was signed into law, immediately 9.1 million acres went into the National Wilderness Preservation System. There are 54 wilderness areas. Today, in 2021, if you round up, we have 112 million acres in the system, over 800 wilderness units managed by 4 different federal land agencies: the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the National Park Service. What did the Wilderness Act do? This is what's so critical to understand the subtlety of all this, that with the passing of the law, we immediately established a system, a national system. We also established a national policy to preserve wilderness, and specifically to preserve wilderness character. We finally have a uniform definition of wilderness. We have a uniform management directive from Congress to the 4 agencies. And we understand that Congress, and only Congress, has the exclusive power to designate wilderness areas. Only Congress can designate, and only Congress can de-designate or undo a designation or change a boundary. That's how significant and how permanent this legislation is. When it was established, 9 million acres came into the system, 54 wilderness areas. They were all national forest wilderness areas in the beginning, from 13 different states, mostly in the West. For those of you in the East, I think it's Linville Gorge, Shining Rock, and of course the Boundary Waters came into the system. All the rest were in the West, and none of the original 64 units of 1964 were from Alaska. That came later. And for those of you who work for the Bureau of Land Management, I do want to assure you that Howard Zahniser and others who were fighting for the Wilderness Act had the BLM, had the Bureau in mind. This is a testimony that Howard gave before the House subcommittee in 1962, and Howard addressed the future contribution of the Bureau of Land Management. He said, perhaps BLM may later find certain lands best suited for wilderness preservation. So BLM was always part of this mix, but it took till 1976 when the statutory multiple use mandate for BLM, known as the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, their Organic Act had to be passed before BLM could start looking at evaluating and recommending wilderness on BLM land for possible future inclusion to the national system. So I offer this illustration to kind of give you a visual of how this all looks. At the bottom layer of the wedding cake, you can have federal land from the national parks or from the Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife Service or BLM. National public lands. On top of that, you can have a wilderness designated by Congress that would be on that federal land administered by that agency. And then you might even have a wild and scenic river designation that runs through that wilderness area. And then on top of that, at the top of the wedding cake, you might even have some agency protection or classification for a special type of area, a research area or wildlife zone. So if looking at the right, a visual that will give you, you have this public land of, let's say, a national park. And inside the national park, you would have designated wilderness. You might even have a wild and scenic river, and then you might even have some kind of a classification like a research area. So here is the Wilderness Act, Public Law 88-577. As Bill Hodge mentioned earlier about the compromise, it took 8 years to pass the Wilderness Act. It was first introduced late in the second session of 1956, and it was purposely introduced late in session so that it could be recorded in the congressional record, but there would be no debating of the Wilderness Act in 1956. That all started in the next Congress of 1957. There were, in fact, there were 66 different rewrites of the bill between 1956 and 1964. 66 different rewrites. There were 18 public hearings, and Howard Zahniser actually testified at all 18 public hearings and generated over 6,000 pages of testimony. So folks, it's without a doubt that there was a huge amount of compromise that went into the passage of the Wilderness Act. And the question in the earlier session about some of those who might have been against the Wilderness Act, Bill Hodge was absolutely right. It's all the ones that you can just imagine. The timber industry, the mining industry, the water resource group was opposed to wilderness. Even the Chamber of Commerce was opposed to wilderness. And initially in 1957, 58, and 59, the Forest Service and the Park Service were not supportive of the Wilderness Act. Now, there's some very good reasons why they did not support it early on. They eventually did, especially with the incoming Kennedy administration. But originally, Zahniser and others had to win over the Forest Service to gain their support for this legislation. One of the little keys to that, we won't have time to go into it now, but do you notice I highlighted in blue in the preamble the words, the permanent good of the whole people. I always found that statement in the preamble to be very interesting. And I wanted to know, why does it say the permanent good of the whole people? And if any of you are curious and want to reach out to me, I'll give you the backstory. But it all has to do with the Chief of the Forest Service and gaining the support of the Forest Service to the Wilderness Act. Also, you see here, Section 1 of the Wilderness Act. In most land laws, the first section of a land law, which is known as the short title, is the title of the act. In this one, it is the act may be cited as the Wilderness Act. So we're going to go over the law. We're going to go over the short title, Section 1. Then we're going to really hone in on Sections 2 and 4. In Section 2, we're going to talk about the system, the policy, and the definition. In Section 4, We're going to look closely at the use in wilderness, the prohibitive uses, and the special provisions. We really will not have time to dig deep into sections 5, 6, and 7. But just so you know, the Wilderness Act has 7 sections, and approximately it's a 7-page document. So here is section 1, which I'd already showed you, but there it is, section 1, the short title. This act may be cited as the Wilderness Act. So if anybody ever asks you if you can recite verbatim from the Wilderness Act, you tell them, yes, I can recite section 1. But notice, here's another little trivia. The so-called, it's called the so-called Eastern Act of 1975, has no section 1. It literally, in the final stages of getting this act ready for Congress, there was a typo in section 1 was left out. So there is no formal title to the Eastern Wilderness Act of 1975. In fact, its real title is called the Eastern Wilderness Areas Act of 1975. But if you look closely at the legislation, there is no title. There is no section 1. Now let's go into section 2, the policy. There's 70 words here. This is a long first sentence of the policy statement that was written by Howard Zahniser in 1956, and it relatively is unchanged from the very first introduction in 1956 to the final words that came out of the Wilderness Act in 1964. But much like Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson lays out why we needed to declare our independence to Great Britain, here in the Wilderness Act, you see the reason why we needed the Wilderness Act and what were the threats that were so important that we needed to protect wilderness because of this. Listen to these threats. In order to assure that an increasing population, accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization, does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States and its possessions, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. What a beautiful opening line. 70 powerful words that shows you the threats and why we needed wilderness. So take a look at the population. Talking about increasing population, because we have been working through COVID and the pandemic and trying our best to get the population vaccinated. Most of you know that here in 2021, we have 331 million people in the United States. But how many, what was our population at the time of the signing of the Wilderness Act? There was a little less than 200 million people. But for Zahnisers and others, they could already see that the population was going to continue to grow and that these landscapes were going to be developed if we didn't take action. So look at that, from 1964 to 2021. So going on in section 2A, this is the first time the words about preserving wilderness character is mentioned, section 2A. It's mentioned here and again in 4B. So if you ever wonder what is the central mandate of the Wilderness Act, It is to preserve the wilderness character. It says, these areas shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such manner as will leave them unimpaired for future use and enjoyment as wilderness, not as a recreation area, but as wilderness, and so as to provide for the protection of these areas, the preservation of their wilderness character. It's right there in section 2A of the Wilderness Act. It goes on to give you a definition of wilderness. And I wanted to stop here and ask you, what if you were challenged with writing the definition for wilderness? How would you define wilderness? Well, for Zahniser and others, the best way to define it was by saying what it was not. What it was not. Wilderness, in contrast to those areas where human and their works dominate the landscape. So wilderness was going to be these areas in contrast to our cities, to our developed areas, to our public lands that already had roads and facilities and had already been used for extraction. Wilderness was going to be in contrast to that. The definition goes on to say in section 2C, an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. I know you've heard about this word, but it is so perfect for the Wilderness Act. Many people tried to get Howard Zahniser to drop this word, to not use it in the Wilderness Act. And he said, no, this is perfect. It is perfectly what we're trying to do to preserve wilderness. Untrammeled means not subjected to human controls or manipulations that hamper the free play of natural forces. That untrammeled means self-willed. Are we capable of letting the wilderness be unhampered by fooling around, by interfering, by manipulating the natural forces? Can we truly leave it alone? That word untrammeled is the only time that is ever mentioned in legislative law, in federal statutes. And that comes from Dr. Mark Harvey, who wrote the book on Howard Zahniser. If this book is not currently in your conservation library, you really do need to read Wilderness Forever, about the life of Howard Zahniser, written by Dr. Mark Harvey. The definition goes on to say, and this, I want you to look at the modifiers, the words used in this definition, and ask yourself again, if you were writing the definition, would you want a definition of wilderness that was very broad and general and encompassing? Or would you want a definition of wilderness that was very defined and narrow? That was the challenge for Zahniser and others as they were trying to think of the definition for wilderness. Here's what they came up with, and listen to the modifiers. Generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. That's in section 2C. It goes on to say that it has outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Furthermore, that it has at least 5,000 acres of land or is of sufficient size, and I put that in red for a reason, is of sufficient size as to make practicable its preservation and use in an unimpaired condition. I'm going to stop and share with you some background to this. The powerful chairman on the House Side Committee was Wayne Aspinall of Colorado, and he opposed the Wilderness Act. And even if there was going to be wilderness, he wanted to make sure that it was only of areas of 5,000 acres or more. He didn't want anything under 5,000 acres. That, if that would have been the law, it would have eliminated many of the wildlife refuge islands. And Zahniser saw this coming, and he fought hard to add these words, or is of sufficient size as to make practicable its preservation. Zahniser fought for this so that the fish and wildlife refuges, especially the very small ones like Pelican Island, 5 acres, Wisconsin islands of 2 or 3 acres, that those small refuges would be part of the National Wilderness Preservation System. And he won. This is how the words came out in 1964. And then it concludes, may also contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historical value. That there's all these attributes that a wilderness can bring to the table, and it might have multiple attributes. It is for those to determine what they want to be in wilderness, and for Congress to designate these areas, and they might be designated because of their ecological attribution. It might not have nothing to do with recreation. It might have everything to do with geology or its scientific attribution. Then we're going to switch to section 4B. You leave section 2, and now you go to section 4. And here again, 2 more times, the Wilderness Act specifically mentions preserving wilderness character. So it's in section 2A and twice in 4B. Each agency administering any area designated as wilderness shall be responsible for preserving the wilderness character of the area, and shall so administer such area for such other purposes for which it may have been established, as also to preserve its wilderness character. So without a doubt, the central mandate of the Wilderness Act is to preserve wilderness character. Section 4 goes on to talk about the uses in wilderness. And yes, it mentions recreation. It mentions 6 of these uses, but these are not the only uses. It just happens to say, except as otherwise provided in this act, wilderness areas shall be devoted to the public purposes of recreational, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, and historical use. But again, these are not the only uses. It's just a listing of some of the uses you would find in wilderness, section 4B. Now in section 4C, we're going to go over the 10 prohibitive uses listed in the Wilderness Act. But I want to mention, before we go down this list, I want to note 2 other presentations that will be given this week, where they're going to go into more detail about section 4C and 4D. First of all, James Sipple from the Carhart Center in Montana. He is the Bureau of Land Management representative at the Carhart Center. James is going to present on the prohibitive uses and the exceptions to those uses on Wednesday of this week. Wednesday at 2:30 in the afternoon on May 26th. Please make note of that, because James is going to go into more detail about these prohibitive uses. And then another one to make note for you is on Thursday, part of these uses that we're going to go over, actually, you might have seen situations or know of situations where some of these things might actually have occurred in wilderness. For example, it says no motor vehicles, but you know of situations where we have actually allowed, for some reason, a motor vehicle in wilderness, or we might have allowed a landing of aircraft, where these uses may be allowed, but only if they meet the test of the minimum required for the administration of the area. It's known as the minimum requirement analysis, MRA. And on Thursday, Dan Abbey, Dan Morris, and John Campbell are going to go over the MRA, the minimum requirement analysis, and the minimum requirement decision guide, the MRDG, which are very important to your job. Those will be discussed on Thursday, May 27th at 1:30, of course, Eastern time, but 1:30 in the afternoon. So please make note of those two presentations. As you look at these 10 listed prohibitive uses, the Wilderness Act sets up where the first two, there are no exceptions. Commercial enterprise is prohibited in wilderness. So are permanent roads. But look closely at commercial enterprise. It's amazing that one of the extractive threats of the 1960s were commercial timber sales. Timber. But there's nowhere in the Wilderness Act where it specifically says there will be no commercial timbering in wilderness. Instead, they speak to the broader no commercial enterprise. So when you look at a tree in wilderness, it has no commercial value. Amazing, amazing when you think about it. No commercial enterprise. Then it says there will be no permanent roads, because that was another threat of the early 1960s, is that our highway system and our roads were cutting into these primitive areas, and you were seeing more and more road building. So the law is set up that says there's no commercial enterprise and there's no permanent roads. Then it goes on to give the remaining 8 prohibitive uses. And isn't that curious that it says no temporary roads? Well, wait a minute. It just said there's no permanent roads. So what is this about temporary roads? Where I researched this, and if you'd like to reach out to me, I'll tell you the backstory of why it would say no permanent roads and then no temporary roads. It's kind of a unique twist aimed at the Forest Service, to be very specific about that. It goes on to say there will be no use of motor vehicles, no motorized equipment or motorboats, no landing of aircraft, and no other form of mechanical transport. Notice that, no other form of mechanical transport, and there would be no structures and no installations. That picture that I've offered there for you is actually the Buck Rogers jetpack. And I offer that because in 1961 and 62, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California was already testing a device that would allow humans to strap on a jetpack and travel across the country without their feet ever touching the ground. The Buck Rogers jetpack. It was already well known in the early 1960s. So for Zonizers and others who wanted to think ahead, it just doesn't say there will be no mechanical transport. It says no other form of mechanical transport, and it included new technology that might be coming in the future, such as this, a jetpack. Fascinating. In section 4D is the special provisions of the Wilderness Act. So we've just finished with 4C with no, 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 no. Now there's these provisions that are going to be allowed. This is part of that compromise that in some cases, there may be aircraft and motorboats allowed where they were prior established before 1964. It's a special provision that the control of fire, insects, and disease may be performed as the secretary deems necessary, that there would be prospecting for minerals. And this was put to an extension of 20 years from 1964 to December 31st of 1983. Prospecting was allowed to continue in wilderness for 20 years, and then it was shut down permanently after December 31st, 1983. There's language in the provision that speaks to water resources, that even the President of the United States might allow a reservoir in a wilderness area if it was in the best interest of the American people. There's also language in there about state water laws. And then the final three, grazing, commercial services, and fish and wildlife as it pertains to the state. We're going to look a little closer at those last three. I want to clarify for you each one of these, because a lot of people starting out in their jobs in wilderness, they don't really understand why is there grazing in wilderness? Well, no doubt it is one of the compromises of the Wilderness Act. And actually, it was one of the very first compromises of the Wilderness Act. Whether it be domestic cattle or domestic sheep, no doubt if you're going to have grazing in wilderness, it's a tramline. Let's admit it, folks. It is a tramline to have domestic livestock grazing in wilderness. But this is one of the compromises. And the compromise was if grazing was prior established before the area became wilderness, it shall continue. It's not a may, it is shall continue if prior established. And then later, the grazing guidelines were actually written to help the agencies understand how the grazing would be applied in our different wilderness areas. For the Forest Service, the grazing guidelines came in 1980 with the Colorado Wilderness Act. For the BLM, the grazing guidelines were added to the 1990 Arizona Desert Wilderness Act. And these guidelines state specifically how our agencies are to allow grazing to continue in wilderness, shall continue if prior established. And that's under section 4D4 of the Wilderness Act. Another one to go into a little more detail is commercial services. In the earlier slide, I showed you that commercial enterprise is prohibited in wilderness, but the law allows for commercial services. And services you can think of like outfitting and guiding. That's a commercial service, and that is allowed in wilderness, but under the condition of the extent necessary clause. You can have outfitting, but only to the extent necessary. That's section 4D5. Well then, what about commercial filming? A lot of you have dealt with this issue or heard about filming in wilderness. Is that allowed? It has been determined that commercial filming is in fact a commercial service, and therefore it may, it's not a shall, it may be allowed in wilderness if it meets certain conditions. The most limiting conditions and the one it must pass is the extent necessary test. So each agency deals with commercial filming slightly differently. So you're going to have to get with your supervisors and find out what your policy is for your agency and how filming and outfitting is allowed in your wilderness areas. And then finally, there's section 47 that specifically speaks to fish and wildlife management in wilderness and the state's jurisdiction and the federal jurisdiction. This clause 47 is essentially a neutral statement. It doesn't give additional powers to the state to manage fish and wildlife in wilderness, nor does it give additional powers to the federal, to the Wilderness Act. It sets up that the state and federal must work in cooperation to meet fish and wildlife objectives, as well as meeting wilderness objectives. And that's section 4D7. So if you look at the simple model, and many of you have seen this model before, but when an area is designated by Congress and it comes into the system, the X along the axis there is where the wilderness comes into the system. It might be a little lower down than this X, might be a little higher, but somewhere it comes into this graph as a place on the designation of this new area. On the left axis, we have wilderness character with the highest amount of wilderness character on the plus side at the top. Along the bottom, we have human influence, where you have very little influence on the left, a lot of human influence or activity on the far right. And what we're trying to do as managers of wilderness is move the designation of this new wilderness closer to the highest part of preserving wilderness character. That is our central mandate, is to move this up the axis in our stewardship actions towards preserving wilderness character. That is our main job. So in conclusion, here's where we are with the system today. The Forest Service, without a doubt, has the most units in the system. The Park Service has the most acres. And if you really want to look to the future, it's probably the BLM that has the potential to add more future wilderness to the system than any of the other agencies. Today, we're at 112 million acres. Who knows? It'll be really left up to the people and how much they support wilderness into the future to see how many new areas and how much the system grows into the future. So with that, folks, I'll leave you with some challenges or thoughts about the future. I do think you as wilderness stewards need to really watch over the encroachments that are coming near wilderness, the concerns of the night sky and our expanding settlements coming right up close to our public lands and to our wilderness areas, and concerns about noise and soundscape. These are things that we might not have direct control over, but we can work with our constituency. We can work with Congress. We can work with our partners to really watch over, to keep our wilderness areas with truly a night sky and a soundscape that we're proud of. I also want to mention about management creep. Whatever agency you work for, we're starting to see more and more pressure, more and more challenges for making decisions to do something in wilderness that normally would not be allowed. The management creep, the cuts, the 1,000 cuts, that one decision is made, followed by another decision, followed by another. And we need to watch over this. we need to really restrict and watch over carefully management creep. And then talking about the sea change that you mentioned in your last presentation, for me, it's looking to the future and the concerns of climate change. We're going to have to deal with this on public lands. What are we going to do about climate change? And what does that mean for wilderness? There will be some that because of certain climate change situations, managers will want to intervene. They'll want to do something in wilderness. And that, I want to caution you, should only be as a last resort. That wilderness is to be untrammeled, to left unmodified, essentially to let it be. And that is your challenge moving forward. Can you really, to the best of your ability, I'm not saying we won't ever intervene in wilderness, but it truly should be a last resort, and we should do all we can to let it be. We're now open it up for questions, and Eric's been managing the chat session. So Eric and Jacob, if you have anything for me.
Yeah, there was a question about commercial filming, Ralph, and I think it got answered. But basically, the question was, is it allowed? And I think you did a pretty good job of answering it. There was an interesting court case, I think last year, that got that was brought against a Park Service unit, like a historical park, that basically the person thought it was a First Amendment infraction, or like a restriction of their First Amendment rights to require a permit, and the lower court actually agreed with that. And I don't know how that's going to affect wilderness, but it's something to watch out for, I think.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. I think for us in the different agencies, we have set up our interim policy or our policies where we can try our best to meet the request, the demands to do filming on public lands and in wilderness in a way that says, can we meet your filming objectives outside of wilderness? Because in many cases, what they're hoping to film is remote scenery. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen in designated wilderness. So we go through a screening, and one of the screenings there at the top is it really necessary? To the extent necessary, does this have to happen in wilderness, or can we accommodate you in another area?
Yeah, absolutely. Ralph, there's another question here from Lynette Miller. They said, I'd love to hear your thoughts about fuels reduction, prescribed burning projects in wilderness due to years of fuels buildup from a century of fire suppression. Should we let it be and let high intensity / stand replacing fires happen? Or should we try to intervene to thin or return to the more natural conditions?
Well, excellent question. Excellent question. And please keep in mind, if you look back historically, this question of fire in wilderness was actually carefully thought about. It goes back to the founding members of the Wilderness Society and Aldo Leopold. They fully understand that fire was a natural agent, and to the best of our ability, we needed to allow fire to play its natural role in wilderness. But then we come up against policies from the Park Service and from the Forest Service that we all know about, the historical years of suppressing fires, leaving us with an unnatural fuel load in a lot of these wilderness areas. So what do? And there is no doubt some areas that are more remote and they have a natural lightning strike, we can actually have it in our forest or our park fire plans to allow a lightning strike to burn in wilderness naturally and set up trigger points as to when we might have to take actions. That ideally would be the case. But I think the question is really coming down to areas where they're closer to nearby communities, or the ability to allow fire to play its natural role is really not possible. It's not practical. And we might actually have to do some kind of fuel treatment in wilderness. Well, our policies are set up that we should try every other possibility first. I personally have been involved in projects where we have done thinning or burning on all three sides near our wilderness areas to make sure we can reduce the fuel load on the west, on the south, and on the east. But in the wilderness area, we still have this unnatural load. So every attempt should be made to reduce the fuel load so that if we do get a strike, we can allow it to burn naturally in wilderness. Now, that's not always the case. There might be conditions where we might actually have to do treatments in wilderness. But in my opinion, it should be as a last resort. The case in point is what just happened in Colorado last summer. There was a large fire up the Cache-la-Poudre Canyon outside of Fort Collins, Colorado. Before that fire started last summer, there was a proposal to do a fuel treatment in the Cache-la-Poudre wilderness. The treatment was because the area was currently under full suppression as far as the forest plan had stated, that there would be no allowance for fire. It was under full suppression. But then the lightning came last summer, a fire took off in that area, and it burned through the entire wilderness. So nature did the prescribed burn that was being proposed by the managers. There's a case in point where we say we can't let it burn, but we did, and we were able to save the homes and the communities on the other side of that wilderness. So I would just like to ask and offer to you that we must do everything we can to follow the idea of wilderness, that having wilderness areas untrammeled, they're probably one of their highest values is that base data, that scientific knowledge of what fire would do, what the landscape will do if it is unmodified and left to manage itself unwilled. We lose that scientific value the minute we start tinkering around in wilderness. And that would be management by prescribed fire or by treatment. I'm not saying there's not a place where we need to do it or can do it, but it really should, in my opinion, be a last resort.
Great. And Pete Irvin put in the chat that there's a session on Wednesday on Wilderness and Wild and Scenic River Resource Advisors for fires. So
thank you, Pete.
Yeah. I have a question, Ralph. How does the Wilderness Act intersect with other laws that managers must follow, like the Endangered Species Act and that sort of thing?
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. So first of all, going back to that discussion of the minimum requirement analysis that Dan, and John will present on Thursday. What happens in wilderness is we get a lot of projects or a lot of ideas to do something in wilderness. And that project, that activity can only be allowed if first it is specifically mentioned in the Wilderness Act that you can do it. And if it's not, then you look to any subsequent law, any later law that added addition to that Wilderness Act. And if you don't find specific language in that subsequent law that would allow you to do that project, Then you finally look at other federal land laws like the Endangered Species Act. Is there something in that act that might pertain to the projects that's being proposed in wilderness? To answer your question, there is no trump card, Eric, that you must comply with both federal laws, the Endangered Species Act and the Wilderness Act, Homeland Security and the Wilderness Act. There is no trump card that you must comply with all statutory federal laws. And you got to find that place in the middle where you can meet the objectives of, in this case, wildlife and wilderness.
Thanks for that clarification, Ralph. If there's any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type them in the chat. I'm monitoring it, so yeah, feel free.
Hey, Eric, Pete Irvin.
Hi, Pete.
Hey, congratulations, Mr. Interim Acting Executive Director.
Thanks, Pete.
So 2 questions. One, when does the Reverend pass the collection plate for us to contribute? And number 2, it might be worth mentioning on a more serious note to folks, if they haven't already looked at Wilderness Connect and the Wilderness Act online session there, that's another great resource that would build on what Ralph has just shared with us. And then the third question, who's the dog?
So that is that's my buddy, that's Lily. And we're reading, I think it would be the Wilderness Forever book right there. And my dog did in fact have a question. But Pete, thank you for joining and thank you for all that you do. But I was getting ready for one of your hard questions and I was going to tell you that you're breaking up. I can't hear you.
Yeah, the connection goes bad every once in a while.
As far as Wilderness Connect, though, thank you for saying that because there are so many resources under Wilderness Connect for all elements of the Wilderness Act, the history, even what you mentioned about fire and reed work, that we have this amazing library of resources under Wilderness Connect. And thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, I'm going to drop it in the chat as well. I tried to, but it's not a live link. Try one more time.
Yeah, and us old dinosaurs know it as wilderness.net.
Ralph, do you see any future in the Wilderness Act being amended or changed in response to climate change or anything like that?
Well, there's always that threat, and thanks for mentioning that, because keep in mind, there is no one in Congress today that was there at the signing of the Wilderness Act of 1964. All of the legislators and everybody we have watching over wilderness or those who are against wilderness that are in Congress today have no understanding of the richness of the history that led up to this law and what it is trying to provide for the benefits of an enduring resource. So if anything, Eric, I would offer that there will always be threats, that there will be somebody who will try to constantly water down or constantly provide a threat to the law and the future of wilderness character. And I think to our partners, to our volunteer groups, and to the American people, the job of wilderness stewardship is never done. And that's why I mentioned climate change. I think the threat for possible intervention is always going to be out there. And so the managers of tomorrow have to be ready to offer alternatives. What else can we do and only intervene in wilderness if it's a last resort. I honestly believe that we should do everything we can to let it be.
It's a good response from a wilderness purist. Any other questions out there? Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask Ralph directly.
I have a question, kind of a probably maybe even much too talked about, but how can you defend against mechanized machinery or human-powered machinery, mountain bikes, when it's argued that they are not mechanized and that they are human-powered?
Yeah. Okay. So as you notice there, the words are, and no other form of mechanical transport.
Mhm.
Well, we will all definitely agree that a mountain bike is transport. So mechanical. If you look at the definition of mechanical, it's any forged, it's manufactured, it's how it is put together. It is mechanically forged. So you have something that has been built using metal to transport a person from A to B. Those mechanical transport, whether it be a jetpack or a mountain bike, are not allowed in wilderness. No matter if it's human powered, it is a transport.
I totally agree. I just always have conflicts with sometimes when those big issues comes up. There was recently, I think Eric might have been referring to a recent amendment again to amend the Wilderness Act, and it's always so difficult trying to find ways to talk to proponents of allowing things like those.
You bet. I understand that. And that's one of those threats that I don't see going away. I think the best argument for wilderness is to come back to the concept of in contrast, that wilderness was to be designated for primitive recreation, and that a mountain bike is just one of many new technologies that will be coming in the future. And we must look at providing opportunities for the American people to enjoy their public lands. But certain uses and certain devices do not belong in wilderness, and nor are they congruent with the law, its definition, and the intent, the spirit of wilderness, to leave it primitive and unconfined. So I do think we have a strong argument on public lands to say we can accommodate mountain bikes outside of wilderness. And there's abundant areas where that type of use can be welcomed and even promoted, but not in wilderness. I would like to offer that very question came up in one of the testimony for Howard Zahniser about driving into wilderness. There were people who are making the claim, well, a lot of these people will not ever see wilderness unless we allow people to drive into wilderness. And in testimony, he made the most beautiful statement that if that ever happened, that we allowed driving into wilderness, they would be driving into something less than wilderness. We would lose the very thing we're trying to protect. I would offer the same for mountain bike or any other new technology that's coming at us. There are places on public lands that we can accommodate that, and we can leave wilderness the way it is for primitive and unconfined recreation.
Great. And then Ralph, just a quick time check. We're at a minute left, but here's a good one. that is from Christian. They said, to what extent, if any, can the Wilderness Act be used to manage the impacts of projects outside of the wilderness boundary that affect species within the boundary? An example would be a road that limits or changes the natural migration of a species into the wilderness, especially when the species is natural for the original ecosystem.
Okay. I caught most of that. If I'm going to try to respond, but if I'm missing the point, if I catch it right, there might be something, an activity or a disturbance outside the wilderness boundary, such as a road, that would actually maybe interfere with the migration of wildlife or certain species going into and out of wilderness. Is that basically the thought?
Yeah, but I think the question is also, and feel free to jump in here, Christian, but it seems like the question is also, can the Wilderness Act be used to stop a project like that?
Ah, very good. Okay, if I catch it, catch it correct, and I know we don't have much time, but the Wilderness Act and the legislation that protects the Wilderness Act only goes to the boundary of the Wilderness Act. It does not, that law does not have jurisdiction on activities outside of the wilderness. But as we all know, what I mentioned about encroachments and other activities that might not be congruent with wilderness, that's where our land managers need to really think of the spectrum of wilderness, that on national forest land or on national park land, if there are proposed activities such as a road that might interfere with wildlife that would have a bearing on wilderness, that's where our managers must have the foresight to think of a spectrum of what an activity here might have implications for over there in wilderness. And so broadening out the concept of the benefits of wilderness, we must look holistically at the entire picture of land management and land classifications. In many cases, we really should have management prescriptions near the boundary that are congruent with the protection of wilderness character to minimize that disturbance that that wonderful question is getting at. Will it always be the case? Maybe not. But can the law stop something from occurring outside of the boundary of the designated wilderness? No.
Great. Thanks, Ralph. And thanks everybody for your attention and your participation in today's session.